Question: what are examples of the fallen beings from your understanding? Well, it's a subtle question to answer. And I've talked about this a little bit before. There are quite a number of questions where people have asked about fallen beings. It's a little bit subtle to answer because when we talk about fallen beings, we're usually talking about people who are obviously evil, in order to give an example that people can recognize. And that's why I have in other videos I've talked about Hitler, Stalin, Mao. And the reason for this is that they killed so many people. They even killed so many of their own people. I mean, we all know about the Holocaust and 6 million people killed in concentration camps. But Hitler, of course, killed more people that were not put in concentration camps. And of course, then there's all the soldiers that were killed as a result of the Second World War, which is like 50 million. Some historians say that Stalin killed 21 million Russian or Soviet citizens during his reign. And Mao, during the Cultural Revolution, especially, killed 70 million Chinese. We're not talking about an outside enemy. We're talking about his own people in order to get rid of anybody who wouldn't blindly obey him. So these are some obvious examples, of course. And in a sense, you could say, beyond just mentioning people, you could say, what helps you recognize a fallen being? And you can have Jesus' statement. Jesus actually talked about fallen beings. He didn't use that terminology, but he talked about those who are like sons of the devil, or like whitened sepulchres filled with dead men's bones, hypocrites, and so forth and so on. And he said, on their fruits ye shall know them. In other words, their actions. Are their actions completely self-centered? Do they have absolutely no empathy with other people? Do they have no respect for human life? Are they willing to kill perhaps large numbers of people in order to defend the physical power they have, or even defend their ideas, their beliefs, or their personal reputation? So, but you have to be careful. You know, it's important. It was important for me when I first started hearing about the concept of fallen beings to have these extreme examples: Hitler, Stalin, Mao. I'm mentioning these because they're in history. I'm sure some Chinese would be very offended if they saw this video and what I say about Mao, just as there are some Russians who would be offended by what I say about Stalin because they still haven't let go of the ideology of Stalin. But I don't think there are many Germans who would be offended by what I say about Hitler. Even though there are probably a few. So it's a little bit, you know, it's like in the beginning, yes, you look at these extreme examples. But then when you get a little more mature in the way you look at this, you have processed it a little bit more, you realize that it isn't quite that simple. Because the fallen consciousness is, and I explained this in many of my non-duality videos. I also explained it a little bit in my playlist about how the world works, where the first video I talk about how the world is created, and I talk about fallen beings. But in some of the others in that playlist, I also talk about how the mind becomes a closed system. And I talk about the duality consciousness. So what we have to add to this is that fallen beings they have used the duality consciousness to set themselves up as being special, as being superior to others. Some of them even think they know better than any outer authority how the world works. In other words, they think in their minds they can define how the world should work, and then they think the world should comply with this. And what they most often do on earth is they try to get other people to agree with them or to obey them. And this can be done through raw physical power like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, but it can also be done through ideas. through getting people to believe in something. An example of this is Marxism. Marxism is a dualistic idea, but it seeks to persuade people. Now, I know that once communism became an actual form of government, they were also using violence to get people to submit. But Marxism in its pure form is just an idea. Religions is another example of this. Scientific materialism is another example of one of these ideas that seeks to persuade people. So, once you start contemplating the duality consciousness and how it works, and I've talked about this in many of my videos, because it's, for me, I think back as a child, right? I've talked about this before. I was probably 10 years old when I was sitting in my parents' living room reading a book with 50, that described 50 world events that changed history. And I had read some of them, the discovery of this and that, X-rays and penicillin and this and that. And I flipped the book and the Holocaust comes up, a description of the Holocaust. And I was so shocked by this. And it became really important for me to come to understand how this could happen. And I did not understand it until I got the Ascended Master's teachings about the duality consciousness and how it works. And you can, of course, when you understand the duality consciousness, you clearly see Hitler used the duality consciousness, the black and white thinking, to define. The German people are the Aryan race, they are superior. The Jews are an inferior race. It is better for the entire humanity that the inferior race is wiped out. He also defined that he was the Führer sent by God to purify the world of these bad people. This is all duality. And it's clear, if you're not a neo-Nazi, it's clear to you that it's a completely flawed line of reasoning. Partly because of the very drastic consequences that it led to. Right? So when you look at this also, you can also see that Marxism is a dualistic idea because it also defines some people are superior to others and there's an inherent conflict between them, and therefore it's justified that those who are superior kill those who are inferior. And Chinese communism, the same thing. Mao's idea is the same thing. But here is what comes at a later stage. Once you have worked through this, seeing the extreme examples of this, you realize that the central feature of duality is that it has two aspects. It defines two opposite polarities, good and evil. And in the beginning, when we start to understand duality, it's easy to see that, oh yeah, these obvious examples of evil, clearly that's dualistic. But when you become more mature and start wrestling with this, you realize that even the opposite polarity is also duality. Even that which is defined as good is dualistic, because it's relative to that which is evil. And that's when you start realizing, as I explained in many of my videos about non-duality, that beyond the duality consciousness is this neutral state of consciousness. It doesn't judge based on a dualistic value judgment. It just observes. And it can clearly observe what is it that's in alignment with the one mind that raises all life, and what is out of alignment with the one mind and therefore puts some part of life down. But you realize that even that which is a dualistic definition of good puts life down. And that means you can now start looking at things from a whole different perspective. And you can see that some of the supposedly good things that happened in the world also were driven by fallen beings. For example, 2,000 years ago, there was a man walking around the dusty roads of Palestine called Jesus. He gave forth a certain teaching that was later written down in part. And for the first 300 years, there were different groups in the Mediterranean area that took Jesus' teachings, emphasized certain things, developed in different directions. But then in 325, there's a Roman emperor called Constantine who suddenly decides, my empire is falling apart, I need something that can unify it, we need a new religion. And here's this Christianity thing, we're going to make that the state religion of the Roman Empire. And Catholics and most Christians will say, oh, but it was a good thing he did. But was it? Because the Catholic Church is actually based on the duality consciousness. Its entire creed, the Nicene Creed, its entire functioning, that's why you can see that the Catholic Church actually persecuted and killed probably close to as many people as Hitler or Stalin. It took longer, but you have the Inquisition, the witch hunts, the Crusades, and you have the fact that in Europe the general population was suppressed for 1,000 years, and that suppression was based on the authority of the Catholic Church, giving authority to the divine rights of kings and the noble class. So what you see here is that Constantine was a fallen being. Many of the popes that you see throughout history have been fallen beings. And of course, I know Catholics would instantly deny this, but I'm just saying, it's not quite as simple. Yeah, it is simple to identify the most extreme fallen beings, but it's not quite so simple to identify all of them, because some of them appear benign and are often seen as benign by various groups of people. And so that's when you need to, in order to really grasp this, you need to develop what I call Christ discernment. And Christ discernment is a subtle thing. I have talked about that in several videos. But basically, it's not something you do with the outer mind, the rational mind, the linear mind, the analytical mind. It's a form of intuition, but it's really more an ability to tune into what I call the one mind or the Christ mind. And therefore you can sense the difference, and it's almost a difference in vibration. It's not the level of words, it's not the level of arguments. It's a form of vibration where you just sense that something resonates with the one mind or something is out of resonance with the one mind. And I have met many people who had a certain degree of Christ discernment. I've had it myself, and it's only become better over the years. So what will sometimes happen to me is that without really thinking about it at all, I'm suddenly seeing a person on TV, or I'm seeing a picture of a person. And it just comes to me intuitively, oh, that's a fallen being. And there's no argument I can give you. It's just a reading of the energy, the vibration. And what one has done, all can do. So all can develop this. But in order to do it, you really have to be neutral. You have to be in a neutral state of mind, because then you get the most accurate reading. And so based on this, you can come to a point where you go beyond on their fruits, ye shall know them in terms of their actions. But their fruits is their vibration, their level of energy. That's the higher understanding of their fruits. And you can read that, and therefore you can see it. And then you suddenly begin to see that some of the people throughout history who have been seen as great men and women, who have achieved something important, have actually been fallen beings. I don't want to mention too many examples, because people get so offended by when you tear their heroes down. But just to give a historical example, Stalin I have mentioned, and at the end of the World War II there was something called the Yalta Conference, and this was Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin who met to basically divide up the world after Germany had been defeated. And they were all three fallen beings. All three of them, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, all fallen beings. And they sat there and they drew lines on a map, and yeah, you Stalin, you get this, all of Eastern Europe, you can take it. We keep Western Europe. And this is what fallen beings do. But many people today see at least Churchill and Roosevelt as heroes who defeated Nazi Germany. In Russia, they see Stalin as the hero that defeated Nazi Germany. So even today, you can look at many of the leaders, and what I will say, without mentioning examples, in later years, there's a concept that's become more and more common out there. It's the concept of a narcissist. And I'm not saying that all who fit the psychological definition of a narcissist are fallen beings. But most of them are. Most narcissists are fallen beings, especially if they achieve power in society. Because one of the things that's characteristic for fallen beings is they want power, or they want attention, or they want privilege. But once they have it, they can never get enough. Many billionaires are fallen beings because they are willing to do anything, no matter how it affects other people, to get money. So you can look at a situation in the United States, for example, where over the last 40 years, more and more wealth has been funneled upwards to the top 2% of the population. And some of these billionaires are considered great businessmen who have been innovators and doing things, but most of them are fallen beings. Because how could you accumulate that much wealth without taking it from people or taking advantage of their labor? And only a fallen being would do this. Because they have no consideration for other people. So once you start being a little more discerning about this, you start seeing, oh, well, you know, why are these people accumulating so much wealth? They seem to be the pillars of society, but are they? The reality is, when you really think about this, is that even our democracies, as I've talked about in another video, are ruled by a small power elite, and most of those power people are fallen beings. They may appear benign. I'm not saying they're like Hitler, they're going to kill millions of people. But they're still taking advantage of the general population. They are not seeking to raise up the whole. They're seeking to raise up themselves by taking from the whole. Whereas if you think about Jesus, what he said is that the more you give to others, the more is going to be added to you from the one mind. The thing is, a fallen being has cut itself off from the one mind. So it can't get something from the one mind unless it fundamentally changes its consciousness. Therefore, a fallen being has to take horizontally. In order to have more than others, a fallen being must steal money, power, privilege, energy, especially psychic energy, from other people. And so that's another way to evaluate it. Is there some people that are stealing energy from other people? When I was a child and teenager in the 1960s and early 70s, most of my classmates from school, they spent all their money on stereo equipment and records, and they were listening to all this rock music. The Beatles, what were they called? Rolling Stones, AC/DC, whatever they were called. I don't remember all the names. But you think about a rock concert. People are totally overpowered. It's like a mass mind that comes in. It's like Hitler's rallies, where Hitler was getting all these people to scream at the top of their voices because he was taking their energy. Well, the same thing with rock musicians. And some other performers as well, but especially the rock musicians, because the rock music hammers the energy down to the lowest chakra, the base chakra. And then it's directed out, often through sexual energy. And they steal it. I mean, I remember seeing a concert on TV. It was a Beatles concert, and there was these young teenage girls that were screaming at the top of their voices and reaching up towards the musicians. And it repelled me so much because I could sense how they were giving their energy. And it's just not healthy. It's not healthy for you to let go of the energy, but it's actually completely against the law of free will to take people's energy like this. So you can see many of these examples of this. And So I think what is going to happen, and it's already starting to happen, but it's going to happen more and more in the coming years or decades, where psychologists are going to overcome this reluctance they have now to take a public figure and label that person as a narcissist. And this is going to become much more common. And I think we're going to go through a period where we're going to look at not only the leaders of history, but even contemporary leaders based on evaluation. Are they narcissists? Do they have narcissistic personality disorder? Because if they do, well, I'm not saying society will start talking about fallen beings, but as I said, most narcissists are fallen beings. It's very likely that if a person is a narcissist, it's also a fallen being. Even if it's appeared to be a, what you might call a benevolent narcissist that doesn't kill people like Hitler, but is thinking he or she is doing something good for society. Because typical for narcissists is they always believe they're right, they never admit they're wrong, they believe they know better than others, so they don't need to listen to anybody. And this sets them up so that they can't change course. In other words, they are in this, what I call the ideological mindset, where they, as I said, in their minds, they make up an idea of how they think the universe works. So let's say it's a person, even a person who's elected president or prime minister in a democratic country. And this person has narcissistic tendencies. So he defines, this is the way society works, this is the way the economy works, this is what I'm going to do. And he makes promises in order to get elected, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do that for you. And typical of narcissists is they want people to follow them, and they claim that they know best and they can fix all their problems. If people would only vote for them, they'll fix all of people's problems. So you're making a promise, a narcissist is making a promise in order to get elected, but the promises are based on this view of how the universe is supposed to work. And then if the narcissist is put in power, he seeks to fulfill his promises based on his vision of how the universe works. But if the universe doesn't comply, he won't be willing to admit this and change course. He will continue to do the same thing over and over again, and if the results aren't as promised, he will go into denial. He'll try to explain it away, deny that it even happens, and insist that everything is just good. Or he will go into scapegoating. And you will see the typical thing, you'll see this more clearly in dictatorships, right? So let's take Vladimir Putin. He attains, over some time, pretty much absolute power in Russia. And he promises the Russian people that if they give him the authority to do whatever he wants, he's going to fix all their problems and give them a good life. But then, of course, it doesn't take that long before it becomes obvious that Putin can't fix all their problems. There are still problems with the economy. The standard of living in Russia is still much lower than it is in Western countries. So the problem here is Putin has absolute power. So if the problems aren't fixed, who's responsible? Well, it's got to be Putin. He has absolute power. But as a narcissist, Putin can't accept responsibility. He can't say, oh, maybe I should change course. Maybe there's something I don't know about how the economy works. So what does he do? Well, it's not Putin's fault that he can't fix all of the Russian people's problems. It's the West, the scapegoat, the external enemy. And you will see this typical of narcissists, even in a democracy. They need to have a scapegoat. They need to have an external enemy so that if their ideological worldview can't fix the problems, they have an excuse. It's somebody else's fault. And that's very, very typical of fallen beings. Always scapegoating. It's a completely illogical psychology, right? Because they want either all the power or they want all the glory. They want to be the hero. I'm not saying that they're all obviously evil, right? But some of them, they want to be the hero who can fix all of society's problems and who is like the greatest president ever, for example. And so they want this, but on the other hand, they're also so afraid of not being able to live up to it. What if it doesn't work? What if I can't deliver on the promises? So therefore, at the same time that they want the glory, they also need a scapegoat if it doesn't work out. So you see what I'm saying? They want the glory, which basically means, how are you going to get power? How are you going to do great things? By taking responsibility for what you're doing. But on the other hand, they don't want to ever be proven wrong. So, and how do you avoid being proven wrong? By not taking responsibility. In other words, it's not my fault. It's the Jews. It's the West. It's the illegal aliens. There's always a scapegoat. So you see, this is the essence of the duality consciousness. It is always contradictory. Fallen beings are a study in contradictions. And you can see this in narcissists. They can't see it. This is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, where they can't see the contradictions in their own viewpoints. They can't see they have one viewpoint, as I said, they want the glory, and another viewpoint, they don't want to be proven wrong. So they both want responsibility to get the glory, but if something goes wrong, they don't want responsibility for that. This is cognitive dissonance. You're trying to do two incompatible things at once. And so that's a very typical characteristic of fallen beings and narcissists. So I think that what's going to happen in the next 10 years is that the awareness of narcissists as leaders, not only in the political life, but also in businesses, for example, or even with ideas, is going to grow. And people are going to be more aware of this, and psychologists are going to be more willing to apply this to public figures. So far, they've had this idea that a psychologist shouldn't call somebody a narcissist if they hadn't had them as their personal client. But as far as we know, Hitler, Stalin, or Mao didn't go to a psychologist and said, "Oh, doctor, I have a problem." So how are you going to evaluate these people unless a psychologist, as some of them have done, have said, but we know more about these public figures than we know about some of our individual clients. So therefore it's perfectly valid to use psychological knowledge and tools to describe the characteristics of a narcissist and apply it to public figures. And I think that there will come a point where it will be applied to anybody who's running for public office, and where you will simply have a way to sort out those who have these narcissistic tendencies. They will not be qualified. As the consciousness is raised among the people, nobody will vote for them. So we are obviously not there, which is why you can see that some narcissists have been voted into office. I mean, Hitler ran for public office in 1932-33 and was voted in by a majority of the German people, and then over the next few years he dismantled democracy in Germany. And so we're still at a point where there are people who will vote for a narcissist. But I think that time is coming to an end, and I think we are going to see in the next 10 years, maybe more, some very obvious examples of what narcissists will do and how wrong it can go when a society, even a democratic society, has a narcissist as a leader.